Hi, Donnie. Thank you for welcoming me to ask my curious questions today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I always love our conversations.
Today, we're going to talk about what it's been like for you living with spasmodic dysphonia and
Mm.
resource that perhaps even surprised you, how this is a resource for you as a leadership coach and a guide, as a strategist, and and what it's taught you about leading from the voice within.
That's yeah, I've been kind of postponing this conversation for a while because one, it's a pretty tender subject, but two, I think I haven't really known how to weave it inside of my work and my brand outside of kind of my normal introductions. Um, but I'll give you a little context and then we can dive into it. So maybe about a month ago, I ended up getting a message from a woman who lives down in the Caribbean. She was a lawyer, and she watched one of my interviews with my nervous system mentor, Irene, uh, about spasmodic dysphonia and nervous system regulation. And we ended up having a conversation and talked for like an hour and a half. And I was like, oh, wow, yeah, I've talked about it in the kind of the healing context, but I haven't really talked about it in the business and leadership context. And for people who don't know, spasmodic dysphonia is a neurological voice disorder. So my voice cuts in and cuts out, from time to time. At one point, I was getting Botox injections into my vocal cords, so it would help relax the muscles. And it's something that I live with day in and day out. And so, I always get people's faces like, what'd you say? Or are you nervous? Like, what's going on over there? And some people don't say it, but they give me the look. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you're probably wondering what's kind of happening. So, um, part of the intention is to share a little more openly and share the story and use this as a way for people to get to know me, um, and not have to explain myself all the time. But I think when you mention kind of having the bouncing back and forth between the voice within and the external voice, I think kind of the voice within over the years, it's almost been 20 years now since I was diagnosed, um, has been there's something wrong with me. And my work initially when I graduated from college was working as a professional actor, and I was working for a presentation skills company. And I'm going into professions where I have to use my voice, and I have this voice disorder that I'm having to navigate. So how do I make it work? Because I'm going to have to interact with people. I'm going to have to speak up several times. People are probably going to hear a stutter, or they're going to have to lean in, and having to kind of navigate all of those nuances on a daily basis. It gets exhausting. And after a while, just you don't want to talk to people. So I really had to learn how to listen to myself, how to take care of my voice, how to take care of my body. The nervous system work that I've integrated over the past 5 or so years has really um, helped with that as well. And so I have a different level of listening and a different level of attunement that I kind of pay attention to when I'm working with managers or leaders or business owners. Um, because even though they're communicating externally and they might not have some kind of voice issue or a stutter, there's also this internal story that is kind of driving the external behavior. So I'm watching that and I'm listening for that because it helps me then connect those two pieces and say, hey, uh, you know, tell me a little bit about, I'm trying to think of a scenario. Tell me a little bit about your hesitation to have this particular conversation. And they're like, oh, well, I don't know how people are going to respond to me, or, my voice shakes when I have to say it, or I get tense in my body when I have to say it and start feeling the tension in my neck. And I'm like, I know that very well. So let's talk about that piece. And then we'll talk about the strategy and the actual messaging or the wording that you have to that you can play around with as you engage in those conversations. And I think they really appreciate kind of that internal perspective and that external perspective.
Oh, that's powerful. I was just thinking of the paradox of like being a voice for others and helping them speak up in the work
Mhm.
environment, and then also being how you physically committed you have to be and intentional probably of what you spend your voice on. Like how
Yeah.
what have you learned about what's worth speaking up about?
Oh my God, this is part of my conversation with the lady. I won't say her name, with the lady I spoke with a couple of weeks ago. But we were talking about how we've had to learn how to find different words to say the same things because some words are easier to say than others, or our voice doesn't catch. So when people come to me, they're like, "Oh, you give me so many different ways to say the same thing," and I didn't really think about it that in the context of like how my living with SD has really forced me to do that. But it's one of the reasons why people enjoy the work that I do with them, because I give them a whole range of saying the same thing. Like one of the things my dad said when I was working in corporate was like, you need to learn how to say screw you in 100 different ways without saying screw you. Like, okay, right. so, so it's become a game for me. And I think that kind of helps take some of the pressure off of needing to find the right word or needing to say it in a particular way. Um, and it takes some of the embarrassment off if I can't get the word out for me. So I'm like, oh, I can't. It's like I'm trying to go down this road and then I hit a dead end because my voice just won't kind of produce the sound. So I have to back up and then go down a different road. And um,
It really,
while
does it feel like setting when you pause and regulate? And I think this is for all leaders, this is part of our journey when we're working with people. Slowing
Mhm.
the nervous system down slows their nervous system down. So, like, your need creates openness for them to
Oh,
hear.
for sure.
If
For
we can
sure.
acknowledge our need, it does create, it's the formula so that they have ears to hear what we're saying. But the vulnerability of acknowledging that we need a minute, like, tell me about the vulnerability piece of that leaders are, that you see them experiencing, but you have like an embodied unknowing of the vulnerability.
Yeah. I think that vulnerability for a lot of the people who come into my world, because they're already thoughtful and kind of highly attuned and empathetic anyway, they get it. They might not necessarily have the language for it or around it,
Yeah.
but they kind of intuitively get it. So when I give them language for it, they're like, oh, that's what I'm doing, right? I'm attuning, or I'm slowing down, or I'm kind of co-regulating. And they they appreciate the language because then they can do it more consistently for themselves when they're not in conversation with me. And
Wow.
that for me is really important. It was like, yeah, it's great if you can do it when you're with me, but you're not with me all the time. So you need to be able to kind of produce that experience for yourself. And I think the other thing that they notice is that then they're able to create space but show up differently inside of work context, even with challenging colleagues or managers or leaders. They're able to listen differently because now they're like, oh yeah, this person is really triggering something in me, but like I can be in the discomfort of the trigger and continue to pay attention to what they're saying. And I might not agree with it. I might
Mhm.
not be able to respond in the moment, but I at least can be in the tension of it. And I give people the example all the time. I'm like, I just need you to stay in the ring. Like you don't have to be a good boxer, but most of the time people are wanting you to tap out. And I'm encouraging you, don't tap out. Because it's going to build a different level of um resilience and strength and courage and respect. And people are going to be like, oh, I thought this person was just going to buckle and, run away. And they're like, no, I might not win. You might get in some good licks, but I'm here. And I'm not going to back down. And so for them, there's this whole opening up of a new version of themselves when they're willing to lean into the vulnerability because they're now saying, oh, my vulnerability actually allows me to handle challenging situations kind of more effectively, or I have more capacity to handle it.
So there's like a level of honesty, of both self-honesty and then allowing their nervous system to disagree in those spaces. How does like navigating like power dynamics come into play for your clients where, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I was just writing something about power dynamics maybe about a week ago, and I didn't really think I shouldn't say that. Um, I knew I was doing it kind of in my own head, but I wasn't explicitly saying it to people. And now I'm more explicitly talking about power dynamics. So when I when I see kind of the power dynamic conversation beginning to emerge, I think a lot of what I share with people is okay, everybody's going to have an agenda and it's likely not yours. So, well, like one, that's something you need to be aware of. And two, do you want to maintain the relationship? And if so, then that changes the way you interact in the power dynamic. Or if you don't want to maintain the relationship, then you'll be okay with saying whatever you want to say and it, completely falling apart or whatever. So I think those two things are pretty important to me when I'm talking to people with power dynamics, and it gives me a sense of where they are kind of mentally as a leader, and it gives me a sense of kind of how they hold the relationship that
Mhm.
they're navigating. I personally enjoy the power dynamics thing because wherever you go or in your personal life or your professional life, you're going to be dealing with it at some level. And so can you make it this fun, playful thing that you're just kind of learning how to get better at? Or is it serious all the time? And you're like, oh, this person, I got to go into this conversation with this person again. I already know how it's going to be, and it's going to drive me that. And you just kind of yeah, 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 yeah about it. And it ends up making it heavier and more challenging because you're already going into the scenario with this mindset of like, this is going to be difficult or like, this is so annoying versus someone who goes into it of like, oh, I'm going to learn something about myself and this person as I go into this conversation. Like I had a client that I was working with last week who's been dealing with some stuff with her manager, and her manager doesn't want to take ownership for being a manager, or nor does she want to do her job. She wants my client to do her job. And she's like, how am I supposed to have a conversation around that? I'm like, well, if you already know that she's gonna ask you to do her job, you can always go into it with, all right, I'm willing to do this, but if I'm willing to do this, then um here are some things that I like to ask for in return. Part of it is a raise. so
Yeah.
and so now she's having to be in the tension of the power dynamic, and she's getting to practice honoring herself and her needs. She's getting to practice advocating for herself. And in this particular example, it's like, when I'm asking you to stay in the ring, it's less about whether or not your manager agrees to what you said. It's more about you getting the words out of your mouth about, here are my needs, and here's what I like, and here's how I would like to negotiate this experience with you. And even if she comes back and says, well, we'll give you a 2% raise and you don't have to work next weekend. That's a win because you move the needle a little bit. So I like to have people not think about power dynamics as so black and white and play more in the gray and the in between.
So like staying in, like allowing the opportunity to get really clear on what wants to come out of your voice,
Mhm.
doing that pre-work rather than coming into the reactivity. And so staying in the body is what I hear. And like, here's whether it's conditions, how to advocate. Because so often it is not knowing how to advocate or what I'm allowed to ask for. Like we don't
Yeah.
know what to expect. Those unknowns, like especially if there's a like status, power, authority, issues there, or there's a history of authority issues or oppression or other, it's like, oh, like, does my voice matter here? And if I know what my voice, what's my truth, then I look at the system of what is happening, what their concerns are and my concerns. It sounds like you're really supporting them in that pre-space, the pre-game of you
Yeah.
being the voice and like the prep and the discipline of that self-honesty and like what's really happening and that self-awareness, so that there's a confidence in those moments that they can advocate in.
But yeah, and you just brought up I think something that's really important that we talked about at the beginning of like uh, focusing on both this internal piece and the external piece. So with this speaking up and using their voice and self-advocacy, there's all this internal stuff that that starts triggering. So their system's like ding, 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 threat, threat, threat.
Right.
Don't do this, right?
Welcome to your personal growth journey.
So there is so much um awareness that they then have to bring to what's happening in their physical body and in their voice. Like, do they tighten when they have to speak up? Do they feel like they're about to jump out of their skin when they have to confront somebody and go into this power dynamic? Are they bracing as they kind of prepare for battle or prepare for the conversation? Right. And so much of the work that I do with my clients and advocate is I will ask them, I was like, yes, let's talk about the head piece, the strategy piece, the messaging piece, what to say. But also, let's talk about this physical piece because that's going to be important for you to pay attention to and take care of both before, during, and after the conversation. So, if you go into the conversation and you're tense, and then during the conversation you're tense, and then after the conversation you're tense, that's just a whole lot of survival stress that you're just kind of holding on to. And if you don't have a way of decompressing and coming down out of that and actively kind of integrating it, then that pattern just reinforces itself. So now every time that I have a conversation with my manager, I'm always bracing or I'm always holding or I'm always kind of redirecting how I say this thing or I'm trying to make it sound better than what it is. And part of part of the work is how do we break those cycles and those patterns? Because they might be familiar, but they aren't necessarily helpful.
Yeah. It makes me think about modulation and
Mhm.
um and like Donnie's leadership and how you're guiding, like what's something that you want to whisper? Like it's not going to hurt Donnie's body, but like what would, if a whisper could carry across the globe to people who are feeling this tension of needing to say their truth, to speak their truth or to speak
Right.
up? Like what would your voice, the least amount of effort out of your body, but what's the whisper that could carry that you could tell them today? You could whisper it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not that hard.
Mm,
It's not that hard. And when I think about it, it is and it isn't. It is because we haven't programmed ourselves to speak in kind of a self-advocating or self-honoring way. And when that hasn't been your norm, then it feels like you're trying to climb a mountain. But if
mm,
you think about it, like I watch people all the time advocate for themselves and they don't do it with any kind of apology or concern or anything. I'm like, how does it just come out so how does it come out so freely? And they are reminders for me of like, oh yeah, if they can do it, then I can do it too. I
mm.
just have to practice doing it. And so over the years, as I've practiced doing it more and more, it becomes easier. And it's funny because when I get reflections back from people and I feel like I'm being too sharp or too direct, they're like, no, that just felt super loving and clear. I'm like, I have this whole story around like being too harsh. Or that my truth is harsh or that my clarity is harsh. And I I don't believe that anymore. I think nowadays I'm like, no, my clarity is my clarity. And it allows me to be clear with myself. It allows me to be clear with you. So if something's not working, I can tell you, hey, that's not working. But I think the difference is that I also will try to help find a solution. So if something's not working, then part of my responsibility is also to say, but can we try X, Y, and Z to see if that works for the both of us as well? And if that person is open to saying yes, then we have there's been a shift in our dynamic and we can go back and forth. But if that person says no, then that requires me to set up a boundary and say, okay, well, great. Then I know I can't engage with you in this particular way. And then I have to deal with the internal stuff of like, okay, here's a boundary that I have to kind of enforce and hold strong to. And people hate it and they respect it all at the same time.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so good. What's a way for people to reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm really active on LinkedIn these days. So you can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm under Donnell Hill and I have Donnie in parentheses. Or I think my title on there in the URL is the Life Maximizer. So you can find me that way as well.
Nice. Thanks, Donnie, for having this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks for talking with me, Kate.
Inspired.
As always, I really appreciate you and I appreciate our conversations and I'm looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.